This is Tom Fox. I would like to welcome you to a special two-part podcast series that I did with Matt Galvin and Dan Kahn. Matt is well known as the outgoing Chief Compliance Officer at AB-InBev and his incredibly innovative use of data, not only in compliance, but literally across the company to make the company run more efficiently and more profitably. Dan Kahn is known for his work at the Department of Justice, both as the head of the FCPA Unit and the assistant head of the fraud section. We have a fascinating part series on how you should deal with the Department of Justice, both in the investigation phase, during the investigation, and post-resolution. Have you ever thought about the intersection of tax and compliance? Well, I had not until I did a 5-part podcast series on Taxman with Tracy Howe on the Compliance Podcast Network. In this part 2, Dan Kahn and Matt Galvin take a deep dive into the Lisa Monaco Speech and its impact on compliance. Dan, if I could turn to you now, and I want to leave the monitorship discussion for some later remarks about the Lisa Monaco Speech, but there are always obligations under a resolution document, ongoing obligations, whether that be a deferred prosecution agreement, non-prosecution agreement, or some other, for continued reporting to the Department of Justice. And I was wondering if you could say a few words on the DOJ's expectation, once again in the non-monitor sphere, that a company would fulfill its obligations under its whatever resolution document is chosen, and then how that communication would be to the department.
Yeah, and you're right, Tom, that MPAs, DPAs, guilty pleas all have the same compliance obligations, at least certainly out of the DOJ criminal division and the SEC FCPA cases. And so that's going to look fairly similar to what the requirements are under a monitorship. It's just that instead of having a monitor review the compliance program and report on those enhancements, the company is reporting on them themselves. And so I think where previously that was an annual thing, and I think certainly when I started in the department, what that looked like was every year the company would submit a report. The prosecutor would review it and may or may not have questions about it. I think that's evolved over time as the compliance, both I would say sophistication and resources within the department and SEC have grown. So to have the expectations around this, and again, I think although DOJ and SEC have become more sophisticated, the experts in this area are still the chief compliance officers and the companies that operate in this space. But at the same time, what DOJ and SEC now expect, a lot of times it may very well be a quarterly meeting. They're going to be much more active in terms of how they are reviewing, questioning, and coming back to the company to try to understand whether or not the company is in fact enhancing its compliance programs, whether they're being tested, whether they're working. The DOJ, for example, now has a unit within the department, within the fraud section. That's the Corporate Enforcement Compliance and Policy Unit. They have dedicated compliance attorneys there whose job it is to help review these reports, to have interactions with the company. They have a set of, there's standard questions, but they obviously, tailor each to the specific company. But this is what they do, and they try to drill down and ask for examples and data and really try to look under the hood of the company's compliance program.
So I'd now like to turn to some of the remarks we heard from the Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco in her October speech. And several things I thought were very striking about it, and I'd love to get y'all's opinion. Dan, if I could maybe start with you, and then maybe Matt, you can follow up on this same point. But we heard a fair amount about corporate culture, and I heard that tied into many of the points she raised: monitorships, totality of criminal activity, investigations, that sort of thing, but a lot about corporate culture. So Dan, if I could maybe start with you on how do you think the department would look or try to assess culture, and then Matt, from the in-house perspective, How would you suggest a compliance officer, a CCO, or a company begin to assess their culture? Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the DAG specifically talked about culture in her speech. I think it was something along the lines of corporate culture matters, a corporate culture that fails to hold individuals accountable or invest in compliance leads to bad results, and talking about holding companies accountable for that. In terms of measuring culture, I mean, this is another area where, DOJ and SEC have evolved over time. When I first arrived at DOJ and for the first few years, I think the types of evidence that a company would come in with and the types of things that would frankly satisfy the government was an email message from the CFO or the CEO or the chief compliance officer out to the employees saying how important compliance is. And I think over time there was a shift both in the way that the DOJ and SEC described it, but also in the way that they measure it. And so the way that they describe it, I think, changed from tone at the top to conduct at the top and middle, and really trying to emphasize the fact that it's not just about an email message or a speech or a video message, that this is about walking the walk. And then in terms of what they look for, again, this is the type of thing where there's a number of questions that they ask around this. Just a couple examples would be the resourcing of the compliance function, whether discipline is carried out evenly or equally among, for example, higher level officers in the company that engage in the same misconduct as lower level employees, or is there disparate treatment, whether the employees who are reporting misconduct feel comfortable reporting it up their business chain to their manager as opposed to doing it anonymously through a hotline. Those are just a couple examples. Now, again, and one thing just to stress on this point, as well as when we were talking about reporting on compliance previously, or DOJ's and SEC's compliance expectations, it really is important to educate DOJ and SEC on why you are making the decisions you're making and doing the things that you're doing in a way that may not meet their expectations. And so simply because DOJ or SEC have seen something at another company that may be better resourced, that may have a different way of doing something in a particular area that may work well for that company, DOJ and SEC may then say, oh, that seems like the type of thing that every company should do, or every company in this industry or in this region. And so that's, again, why it's important for the chief compliance officer, who really is the expert in this area, to have the role not just informing DOJ about the steps that they have taken, but also explaining why they haven't taken the steps that they haven't taken that DOJ may be asking about, or questioning why they haven't done something. And so that also applies. There may be a very good reason, for example, why the compliance function is resourced or set up a certain way that DOJ may ask about or scrutinize, but there may be a very good reason for it, and explaining and walking DOJ and SEC through that can go a very long way.
Matt?
That's a pretty awesome answer that's hard to follow, but let me try and come up with some kind of other kind of gaps that I might suggest. One, I would start with the money. What are the kind of financial incentives, not just for compliance officers should get paid more. Sure, we should all get paid more. It's very self-aggrandizing. But I'm more about looking at the incentives for the executives. One of the first things I did when I took over the CCO role was we had kind of extended vesting periods for compensation, incorporate ethics clawbacks within vesting, so that if we found that somebody had engaged in ethical misconduct, 3 years later, we could still claw back equity grants, from that period, which was super powerful. And I think that's one thing, as Dan said, it used to be an email. But, my question would be, is the money literally, where their mouth is? I mean, are you actually incentivizing, executives' pocketbooks, to do the right thing and doing it in kind of an intelligent way? That would be one. I think you could look at structure, and I think there's different objective ways you can look at the empowerment and independence of a compliance function, specifically the consequence management function. And I think that goes to other metrics Dan's saying about, okay, are you punishing more senior people the same way more junior people? And I think there's a lot you can do in terms of getting kind of ethical climate from different data sources. Dan mentioned reporting lines. You can, and there's a lot of little things you can do that the kind of science is beginning to point out that if you ask someone at the end of a helpline report whether they'd like to be anonymous rather than the beginning, you actually, in one study I saw, doubled the likelihood that they would give their name and information. And that's huge because in my experience, when I looked at the data across AB-InBev, our ability to substantiate a case was roughly double if the person gave their information and contact details, because then you can go back and ask them the questions and investigate. So one small kind of data nudge change can have huge, profound consequences and make the whole kind of operation work that much better. And I think, well, it's difficult to come up with metrics to say thoughtfulness of a compliance program. That's certainly one that you can see effectiveness. And are you being effective in terms of consequence management, in terms of outputs? And then you can look at other kind of indicators as well. Over the last year, we did a lot kind of borrowing from marketing teams, looking at net promoter score across compliance activities and looking for kind of ethics net promoters in reaction to training. And were people actually positively supporting ethical compliance endeavors, or were people, just kind of detracting or indifferent to it and kind of doing it because they had to? And you can get very interesting insights into how effective your old training mechanism is as part of compliance. And the last is a bit of mission, Tom. I mean, you keep mentioning compliance. I think the evolution of the compliance officer into either an ethics or integrity officer is something that is beneficial to the space. And as you kind of look at cultural, more broadly, compliance by definition is following a set of rules that you don't want to follow, where ethics is about kind of empowering people to behave in a better, more integral way. And I think as that role shifts, you kind of take on a bigger cultural responsibility and you take on a broader mission, and you kind of move away from kind of documenting a process and moving more towards influencing behavior. And I think that's going to be kind of core to how you evaluate kind of an ethics program as opposed to a compliance program, because they're in many ways two different things.
We're going to have a quick word from our sponsor, and we'll be right back with more from Dan Kahn and Matt Galvin. I'd like to now ask you guys about the part of the Monaco speech that talked about all regulatory investigations that a company may have been engaged in or regulatory violations communicated to the Department of Justice. And I saw that as a part of this broader corporate culture discussion. It also has had quite a bit of pushback from the White Collar Defense Bar and others. But I wanted to ask your opinions. Dan, do you see this as really a part of this corporate culture discussion, or do you see it as maybe something else?
It's a really good question, and certainly I think you could view it through that lens of corporate culture. I think what I and others in the defense bar, and I imagine a number of companies, certainly ones that I've spoken to, are concerned about is the notion that you can be a multinational company with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees, and one employee engages in misconduct in some far-flung subsidiary that is imputed to the company involving one type of misconduct. The company fully remediates, cleans it up, terminates the employee, puts in place stronger controls, and then 10 years later, a different employee in a different subsidiary engages in completely different misconduct that implicates different controls. That really doesn't speak to the culture of the company. If anything, I think it shows that the company's culture is strong, that they remediated after the first misconduct, that the new misconduct also involved a lower level employee implicating different controls. And so to hold that against the company, I think is certainly concerning, and in some ways, doesn't align with an attempt to try to incentivize good compliance and reward a good corporate culture. And so what has yet to be seen is what the details around that review are going to look like and what the consequences are going to be. And so is the government going to factor in whether the conduct was similar, whether they implicated the same controls, whether it involved the same employees, how far apart it was, how high level it went. And I think that those are the types of things that you hear some folks after the DAG speech putting a little bit more color around. And, certainly we heard the AAG over the criminal division, Kenneth Polite, who himself was a chief compliance officer, and he oversees all of the FCPA cases and oversees a lot of the BSA cases, financial fraud cases. And so the fact that he is out there talking about those distinguishing factors, I think is important and very helpful.
And Dan, if I could follow up with you on another point or topic from the Monaco speech, which is monitorships. I heard or read the speech rather, and it seemed to me that it rejected or at least removed the requirements set forth in the Benczkowski Memo. I think others have a little bit different view on that. Where do you think the Benczkowski Memo is now around monitors, and how do you see the DOJ assessing monitor use going forward?
Yeah, so it's funny. The DAG was actually very careful in the way that she phrased it. She said that to the extent that monitors were disfavored in the last administration, that she was going to be rescinding that guidance. But she didn't say that they were in fact disfavored, and she didn't point to a specific policy or line item where that she was changing. And at least as far as I know, to date, the Benczkowski Memo hasn't been changed. And so I think there was at least the perception that there were less monitors in the last administration than the prior one. I don't know that that's entirely true. I think that there was 1 year in 2016 where there was a pretty big spike in the number of FCPA monitorships, for example. But if you look before that and you look after that, the Obama administration actually looks pretty similar to the last 4 years in terms of the number of monitors. And I think there has been a recognition that monitors, although they serve a very important function in certain cases, in appropriate cases, they can also be extremely disruptive to the business. They can be extremely costly. There's a significant risk or possibility of mission creep. And so, I think that administrations, the last administration, but also the Obama administration and the Bush administration have entered into them, deliberately and ensuring that they are necessary in most cases. And so it will. I think we just don't know yet. Again, as with prior misconduct and what impact that will have. The DAG has announced this corporate crime advisory group. I imagine one of the things that they will be addressing is this exact issue, when monitors should be imposed. But again, it has long been the practice of the department that monitorships are not punitive. They're rehabilitative, and so the primary driving factor for when the department or the SEC put in place a monitor is based on what the compliance program looks like at the time of the resolution. And that's yet another reason why it's really important, as Matt was saying earlier, that you start remediating very early on, as early as you can, and making compliance enhancements throughout the investigation, so that when you get to that point, you're not just talking about steps that you plan on making or that you're in the process of making. You can talk about compliance enhancements that were made, that were tested, and that are proven effective. Because even if the compliance program has been implemented by the time of the resolution, if it's not tested at that point, the DOJ may very well put in place even a hybrid monitor to test the compliance program.
Matt, if I could turn to you on a little bit different focus question. As a CCO or compliance professional, how would you use the information from a major Department of Justice announcement, such as the Lisa Monaco speech in October, internally? Would you give that information to the board in a presentation? Would you sit down with senior management? Would you ask outside counsel to perhaps draft a memo on the significance? How do you use that information internally?
No, it's a great question, Tom. And it actually reminded me a few months ago, I was talking to the CCO of a major logistics company who pointed out that a lot of his audit committee reports were increasingly almost 40, 50% about external developments, what was happening outside the company. And I really took that on because it occurred to me that, my history of reporting to the board, very little had been, it was all about what either the company was doing. And, I love to talk about myself, what I was doing or what my team was doing. And I realized, I wasn't giving them enough view of what was happening outside. And, that realization kind of happily fell around, around the same time that memo landed. And we pivoted, and now our kind of board updates and our audit committee kind of updates, my senior management updates, became about 20% what was happening outside. What were the external factors? What's happening in industry? What's happening, between kind of Brazilian enforcement or Guatemala or China or Nigeria and all these different kind of major markets for us? What was happening enforcement-wise, in addition to the U.S. and how that was driving. That's certainly critical in corruption in the sense that there's kind of cycles and rising and low tides as the moon goes around the earth in terms of corruption enforcement, but even more so in areas of digital ethics and, data privacy, where that kind of, that is a very big moving target. And certainly with, more focus on ESG and more focus in the kind of intersection of the role between the CCO and different ESG reporting and the opportunity that creates. I think it's super important to educate your board on kind of, what is justice looking at in terms of criminal enforcement, what's happening with ESG in terms of stakeholder, and, where's the money moving with ESG and how is that going to influence behavior, and then digital ethics and technology and how is technology changing the function. I think it's incumbent upon every CCO to not only be on top of those three issues, but talking to their board about it regularly, because that also, I think, is very enhancing and productive for the compliance function generally.
So, gentlemen, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I have to thank both of you two. This has been a great recording. And I wanted to end by asking if any of our listeners wanted more information on any of the topics that we've talked about today, or perhaps yourselves, what would be the best way for them to find out more? And Dan, if I could start with you.
Sure. You mean like just contact info? Yeah, sure. Sorry. So you can email me anytime at daniel.kahn, Kahn, at DavisPolk.com. And, I have a firm bio page that you can click on as well on my emails there.
And for me, like any creature of the social media age, I think my LinkedIn profile has had a better or more robust career than I have. And so it's best to just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'll get back to you that way.
Guys, this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time and perseverance as much as anything to make this podcast happen. And I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Dan. It's been great.
Thanks so much.
This is Tom Fox again. That concludes part 2 of this special 2-part podcast series with Dan Kahn and Matt Galvin. If you didn't have the chance to check out part 1, I would urge you to go back and listen to it as they walk us through several key decisions around working with and dealing with the DOJ during an FCPA investigation. I hope you'll join me again next week for another episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.